Some histories don't exist in books. Some histories remain cold, even centuries after the fire that was meant to erase them. Can you feel it? The chill rising from the stone beneath your feet right now? I'm not talking about the dead, curated history behind glass. That museum-lit, sanitized version of the past that just waits for you to walk by. We aren't standing there. We are standing in a place that breathes. A place where the scent of cedar is cut by the sharp tang of old blood and the mineral darkness that has never seen the sun. High above, a bell strikes once, a warning that travels through ages of silence. The priests don't stop walking. They never do, because they knew the truth that we try to bury. The darkness isn't just an absence of light. It is a presence. It is a predator. Welcome back. We're going into Assyria now. I want to be careful here, because I'm not sure I can do this right. Not the Assyria that ends up behind glass, the one with the informational placard and the little arrow pointing at the carved relief of a lion, mid-collapse, legs giving out, 3 arrows in its side. That Assyria doesn't breathe. It sits there. It tolerates you. You walk past it and you feel nothing, except maybe a vague guilt that you feel nothing. And then you go find the gift shop and buy a postcard you will never send. That place, that dead, curated, fluorescent-lit place, that is not what we are standing in. What we are standing in breathes. It is dark and it is cold, and the stone under your feet is actual stone, not a metaphor for stone, not an evocation of stone. Cold. The kind of cold that comes up through the floor and into the bones of your feet before you've taken 3 steps. The kind of cold that a building holds onto because it has been holding it since before anyone now living was born. The air smells of cedar, and under the cedar, something else. Animal fat, old blood, the particular mineral darkness of a place that never quite sees the sun. Somewhere above you, a bell strikes. Once. The sound falls through several floors of stone before it reaches you, and the priests don't stop walking. Here is what most people think. Most people think there was nothing. Before Greece, before Rome, before the philosophy and the democracy and the sculpted marble bodies, most people imagine some kind of primordial silence, cave people huddling at fires, inventing gods to explain what they didn't understand. The thunder, the flood, the fever in the night. Primitive minds making primitive stories because they were frightened and small. This is wrong. I don't mean slightly wrong. I mean completely structurally wrong in the architecture of it. Assyria did not build its gods out of fear. It built them out of knowledge. Assyria had looked at the universe with the full force of its attention for centuries without flinching, and what it concluded was that the universe is genuinely dangerous, not metaphorically dangerous, actually dangerous. The dark is real. The things moving through it are real. And what the Assyrians did, what makes them strange even now, strange in a way that makes the hair on your neck do something, is that they named what they saw. They named it, they wrote it down, they pressed it into clay and kept it. What they named was not comforting. The Assyrian gods loved blood. I'll just say it plainly. The gods of pestilence moved through a city the way a hand moves through water, which is, I know that's not quite right. That simile. It almost works, but it doesn't seal. Let me leave it there anyway. The point is, they moved and nothing stopped them. The point is, the Assyrian kings, the most violent men in the ancient world, men who built monuments from the bodies of their enemies, men who skinned prisoners and hung the skins on city walls and then wrote about it in matter-of-fact language that reads, even in translation, like a man describing his afternoon. Those men were terrified of their gods, genuinely terrified. You can feel it in the clay. You can feel the shake in the hands that made those marks. To understand why the gods came out the way they came out, you have to stand in Ashur first. Not the god, the city. Ashur sat on a limestone bluff on the western bank of the Tigris. The river ran fast and dark below. The desert began immediately behind. This was not a comfortable location. This was a defensible one, chosen by people who had understood from the beginning, before the empire, before the army, before any of the bronze and iron accumulation of power that would eventually reach Egypt, that survival was the primary requirement and everything else was secondary. The limestone was not soft. Nothing about Ashur was soft. Summers that pressed down with a physical weight, a heat that seemed almost deliberate in the way it pushed back against the body's ordinary functioning. Winters with winds, coming down from Anatolia. Winds the people of the city had learned to read over generations. Not learned intellectually, but learned the way you learn something that has hurt you. With the body, with the instincts, with a vocabulary that had developed specific words for specific winds from specific directions in specific seasons. The Assyrians knew the wind. Let me collect the thread here, because I've been circling something, and I want to say it directly. The dark gods grew from this ground, from this limestone and this river and this particular cold. They were not constructed in leisure. They were not philosophical. They were the product of a civilization that had never been comfortable, never been safe, never stood somewhere and looked at the universe and had reason to believe the universe was looking back with anything like warmth. What the Assyrians had learned, generation by generation, the way you learn something that keeps proving itself, was that the universe moves according to its own principles, and those principles have nothing to do with human preference or human pain. And the only intelligent position relative to this fact was to learn the principles as precisely as you could, and to perform your relationship with them as correctly as you could, and then to accept that sometimes, even performed correctly, it would fail. The flood comes anyway. The plague comes anyway. You get up the next morning anyway. The empire, the thing that emerged from this ground, the thing that stretched. And this still stops me when I actually sit with the geography of it. From the mountains of modern Iran to the Mediterranean coast, from the Anatolian highlands, down through the Mesopotamian plain, and then further into Babylonia, into the delta, and then further still, until Ashurbanipal's army stood at the Egyptian border and kept going, into Egypt, into Memphis, into Thebes, which had been a city longer than Assyria had existed, and the Assyrians bent it, just bent it, folded it into the empire like a piece of cloth. I find I keep wanting to slow down here, and I'm not sure why. Something about that particular moment, the army crossing into Egypt, the oldest civilization on earth, suddenly becoming a province, feels like it deserves more. But I'm going to rush past it because the dark gods are what we came for, and if I start on the Egyptian campaigns, we'll be here until dawn. Terrifying. That's the word. And I mean it in the original sense, the one that hasn't been diluted yet. Not terrifying as in impressive, not terrifying as in overwhelming in a good way, terrifying as in the thing that made other people afraid, the shape that appeared on the horizon of everyone else's worst dreams. For 1,000 years, 1,000 years of that, the dark gods of Assyria, we are going in. But here is the thing the history scrolls skip. The thing that gets buried under battle lists and king names and body counts. And the body counts were staggering, genuinely, the kind of numbers that make you put the book down and look at the wall for a minute before you can continue. What gets buried is this. The Assyrians woke up afraid every day. Every single day of that magnificent, savage, world-altering civilization, they opened their eyes in the morning and they were frightened. Not of their enemies, not of the armies pressing at the borders, not of the palace conspiracies running through the corridors like water through cracked stone. Something older than all that, something more patient. They were afraid of their gods, and their gods, as we are about to find out, earned it. The world the Assyrians inherited was already ancient when they got it. The Mesopotamian theological tradition, by the time the empire hit its peak, 9th, 8th, 7th centuries before the Common Era, was already thousands of years old. Sumerians first, then Akkadians, then Babylonians, each one handing their gods to the next civilization like a worn set of tools, smooth from use, familiar in the grip, still capable of cutting if you held them wrong. The Assyrians took all of it and sharpened it, a tradition already characterized by darkness and divine indifference, and the Assyrians concentrated it, pressed it down, made it fit the world they actually lived in, which was a world of war and plague and the perpetual grinding uncertainty of a land where the rivers gave everything and took it back in a single season. The principle was simple. The gods were forces, vast, impersonal, indifferent, occasionally vicious. The only relationship available was submission, obedience, propitiation that never stopped, never quite worked, never let you rest. You did not pray to these gods the way you'd pray to something that loved you. You negotiated, you bribed, you performed the ritual with exact precision because you knew, in your blood, in the part of the brain that never fully sleeps, that a wrong word, a wrong gesture, a priest's hand trembling at the wrong moment, and the thing you were trying to appease would notice, and it would remember. What they built, in the end, was a civilization of ferocious, sustained intensity. 2,000 years, in its various forms. Art sophisticated enough to stop people in the middle of museum rooms. I'm not being loose with that. It actually happens. I've seen it happen. Someone stops in front of a relief panel and just stands there longer than they meant to, and they can't quite explain why. Administrative systems, legal systems, communication networks, the most complicated organizational structure the ancient world had yet produced, the most ambitious attempt to hold a large, linguistically chaotic, culturally diverse population under a single governing apparatus, built through extraordinary violence, built using methods of population control, mass deportations, systematic terror, the public staging of conquered enemies in ways designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance that were, by any measure, the most brutal in the ancient world. And I want to be careful here because, no, I want to say it plainly. This does not make them simple. They were comprehensively, terrifyingly human. Let me collect the thread. We start with Ashur. The god, not the city. Though the city matters, I'll come back to the city. But the god first. The one who shares the city's name, who may have been born from the city or may have given birth to it. The sources don't resolve that question cleanly, and I'm not sure it can be resolved. In the imagination of the Assyrian people, Ashur was simultaneously the most local of deities, god of this limestone bluff, this bend of river, these specific people, and the most cosmic, the god whose will was the structure of reality itself, the one whose name the empire carried the way you carry. I don't know, like something that has healed but hasn't quite released. That's the best I can do with that. Ashur was not a war god at the beginning. This is important. This is unsettling, because it means what Ashur became was chosen. In the earliest texts, Ashur is something close to a city deity, local power, concerned with the immediate, the practical, almost, and I use this word carefully and probably wrong, almost contained. A god whose ambitions matched the ambitions of his people, which were modest, which were survive, hold the bluff, keep the river. Then Assyria grew, and Ashur grew with it or ahead of it, or the two things grew in some locked feedback between them that the Assyrian kings themselves probably couldn't have disentangled if you had asked them directly. You can't always tell with a civilization and its chief deity, which is the reflection, whether the violence of the empire produced a god of war, or the god of war produced a civilization that needed to believe its violence was sanctioned from above, that the cities it burned were offerings, that the prisoners marching in chains were acts of devotion. I find this genuinely hard to think about clearly, and I'm not sure my difficulty is intellectual. By the height of the empire, Ashur had become something almost past describing. The royal inscriptions, those long, relentless slabs of text carved into palace walls, into cliffsides, pressed into clay tablets buried in building foundations. They describe him as the great Lord, the King of all gods, the one whose will is the shape of the universe, depicted, when depicted at all, as a winged disk, a sun disk with wings, hovering over the battlefield, hovering over the city, hovering over the king, always watching, never quite visible, never quite gone. Think about what it means to have a god like that watching everything. Every Assyrian victory belonged to Ashur. Every conquered city was a gift laid at his feet. Every prisoner walking in chains through the gates of Nineveh was walking toward Ashur. The king was the instrument, the hand of the god made flesh, the voice of the god made audible, which meant that when the army lost, when the harvest failed, when the plague arrived, Ashur was sending a message. The message was always the same. You have not been sufficient. You have not given me enough. Anyway, there was a loneliness in this theology that I keep coming back to, that I find hard to leave alone even when other things are waiting. The relationship between king and god was perpetual debt. The king owed Ashur everything: the throne, the victories, the children, the land's fertility, the people's compliance, and the debt accumulated without ever being dischargeable was never designed to be discharged. And sometimes, beneath all the boasting in the inscriptions, beneath the catalogues of burned cities and stacked bodies, and the relentless self-aggrandizement of men who never admitted weakness in any official text. Sometimes you can feel it, the exhaustion, a man carrying something impossibly heavy from the day of his coronation to the day of his death, and he knows he cannot put it down, and he doesn't let himself think about what would happen if he tried. The inscriptions don't say this. I'm reading it in. I might be wrong, but I kept the detail. Ashur was the daylight god, the god of armies and politics, and the bright machinery of empire. The night had different owners. They had no interest in empire. Victory meant nothing to them. The outcomes of battles, the fortune of kings, they were indifferent to all of it. What interested them was the individual human body, specifically the body horizontal in the dark, breathing too fast, awake when it should be sleeping, listening to the sounds coming through the wall and trying to determine, with that particular quality of attention that only exists at 3 a.m. when you are alone, which sounds belong to the world and which sounds belong to something else. Lamashtu came first. When you thought about the night, when you lay there listening to whatever the night was doing outside the wall, she was the first one your mind went to. Daughter of Anu, the great sky god, the highest of the high. And this is the thing. This is what separated her from ordinary monsters, from the crawling things of the abyss, from the demons conjured by sorcerers in bad texts. She was legitimate. She had a father at the top of the cosmic hierarchy, a father with genuine authority. And she had taken that authority and that legitimacy and that divine inheritance, and she had chosen with what reads in the tablets like actual and aesthetic preference, to dedicate herself to destroying the most vulnerable things in the world. She targeted infants and the mothers who nursed them. This was not metaphor. I want to be precise about this because the temptation is to read it as metaphor, to say the Assyrians were processing infant mortality through narrative, making the unbearable bearable by giving it a face and a name. And yes, that's true. That's also true. But the Assyrians did not experience it as metaphor. Lamashtu was real. She came through the window when the lamp went out. She moved through the wall when the protective amulets were incorrectly placed. She crouched beside the cradle. Lion head, bird wings, bird feet, donkey's teeth. And she touched the baby with one hand and the nursing mother with the other. And she took what she wanted. What she took, the milk, the breath, the color in the cheeks, the warmth. She was the explanation for what we would now call sudden infant death, for the fevers that consumed newborns with a speed that left no time to respond, for the infections that turned small bodies blue in a single night, the explanation for when you had done everything right, when the birth was clean and the baby was strong and the mother was careful, and you still woke to silence from the cradle. The protective rituals were elaborate, unceasing. Figurines of Pazuzu, and I'll get to Pazuzu, he needs his own space, were hung in the rooms of pregnant women and new mothers, because Pazuzu, himself a demon of wind and disease, was Lamashtu's enemy, was understood to drive her back. Priests performed rituals involving clay figurines of Lamashtu herself, designed to trick her into taking up residence in the clay, to convince her the clay body was the living one, to lure her away from flesh. The figurines were then disposed of, buried, burned, cast into the river. the hope being that she would go with them. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the priest came in the grey morning and told the mother that something in the sequence had been wrong, the words spoken without sufficient precision, the figurine prepared incorrectly. And so Lamashtu had seen through it, had taken what she came for and left, and would come again. I need to pause here, because I've been moving through this quickly, and I don't think I should. There's something about the specific cruelty of that theology, the one that puts the failure of the ritual on the priest's trembling hands, on the mother's grief-fogged attention, on the imprecise syllable in the darkness, that I find hard to process at speed. Imagine what that does to a person across a life. Imagine being a priest who has performed that ritual 100 times and sat with 100 mothers in 100 grey mornings and said it was insufficient. We were insufficient. Not the universe. Us. Imagine being the mother, lying in the dark beside the cradle, counting breaths, listening for the quality of each one, trying to determine from the sound whether Lamashtu was already present, already working, already reaching. Stop, because that weight, that particular crushing weight, is what the night theology was built to carry. The Assyrian theology of the night was a theology that looked at you and said, yes, the thing you're afraid of is real. It comes in the night. It wants what you have. And here is the ritual. It may fail. Use it anyway. Pazuzu, who is probably the most recognizable of the Assyrian dark gods to modern eyes, though we recognize him through the wrong door entirely, through a particular American horror film, a green-lit room, a spinning child's head. And I understand why that image attached itself to him. I do. But what a reduction. What an enormous reduction of something genuinely stranger than that. Genuinely more interesting than that. Pazuzu was a demon of the southwest wind. Man's body, dog's head, or lion's. The iconography shifts across centuries. The accounts don't agree. And I've decided I don't need them to agree, because the disagreement is itself informative. Wings, scorpion's tail, clawed feet, serpent's phallus. His face twisted into an expression that might be agony and might be ecstasy, and was probably intended as both, simultaneously, because the distinction wasn't meaningful to the force he represented. He brought the hot, dry summer wind, the one that withered crops, spread disease, drove the temperature past the threshold of danger, associated with locusts, with fever, with the illness that arrives from a specific direction and moves through a population with a speed and a selectivity that feels like intention, that feels like something with preferences, with grudges, with a list. He was pestilence given a face, and he was what you hung above the cradle. This is the thing that makes the Assyrian theological imagination, I want to say, remarkable here, but that feels like I'm patting it on the head, which isn't right. What I mean is, the logic embedded in the practice of hanging Pazuzu above a newborn is a complete and coherent account of how the universe functions. The universe is forces, all of them amoral, all of them operating according to logics that have no relationship to human welfare or human fairness or the things humans consider themselves owed. Pazuzu protected the infant not out of warmth, not out of any concern for the small life in the cradle, but because Lamashtu was his enemy. The baby's survival was incidental to a war between powers that preceded the baby's birth and would continue after everyone in that room was dead. The baby was caught in the geometry of something enormous. The best a parent could do, the absolute best, was to arrange the enormous forces as carefully as possible and hold still. There is a practical wisdom in this that I find myself. I keep stopping on it, turning it over, and I'm not sure why I find it so compelling to sit with, but I've kept it. Pazuzu above the cradle, the baby breathing, the mother watching, the night moving around them, doing whatever the night does. Let me collect the thread. The darkest of the Assyrian powers was Nergal, the one the priests approached with the most care, the one whose name, even in the tablets, carries a particular quality of caution you can still detect 3,000 years later, the way you can sometimes detect the shape of a fear in the careful way someone avoids a word. Nergal was the god of death, but saying it that way loses the texture. Hades was an administrator. He ran the underworld with bureaucratic competence, impersonally according to procedures, because it was the role assigned to him in the division of the cosmos, and he performed it without passion and without appetite. I'm rushing through Hades because Hades is not what we're here for, and there isn't time. Nergal was the cause of death. He went out into the world and brought it back with him. He did this, and this is where the tablets become genuinely uncomfortable, where even accounting for the formulaic language of ancient religious texts, something comes through. He did this with appetite, with what reads as genuine preference for the work. Depicted as lion-headed, powerful, armed, moving through a city in the form of plague and pestilence, taking people not one at a time but in hundreds, in thousands, moving through a population the way fire moves through dry grass. The image comes from the tablets, more or less, though I've adjusted it, and it's almost right. It's almost the right image, but it's a little too familiar, a little too known. And Nergal was something you had never seen before, and I'm not sure dry grass gets there. He moved, he took, he did not keep accounts, that's all. That's what he was. The priests named him, the kings feared him, the mothers hung Pazuzu above the cradle and still feared him, because Pazuzu could maybe stop Lamashtu, and nothing stopped Nergal. Nothing drove Nergal back. Nothing tricked him into a clay figure. You propitiated him. You performed the rituals with shaking hands. You laid the offerings down and stepped back. You hoped. The night held all of this. The night was full. Nergal ruled Erkala, the great land of no return, the place beneath the earth where the dead went, and from which nothing came back. And I want to be careful here, because I've said that kind of thing already tonight, and I don't want it to go flat. But there isn't a better way to say it. So, nothing came back. That was the whole of the doctrine. You went down and you stayed down, and the question of what you experienced there was a question the living were not equipped to answer. And the Assyrians, to their credit, did not pretend otherwise. But Nergal's relationship with death was active. He went out. He walked through the living world in the form of epidemic, in the particular fever that turned skin yellow and eyes the color of old ivory, in the cough that started in one person and within a week had moved to 20, and within a season had moved through an entire city. He was a mechanism of death, moving, intentional. The Assyrians understood, and this is one of those things I find I can't quite explain my way into from outside. I can describe it, but I can't fully account for the quality of the knowing. They understood in their bodies, before their minds caught up, that any time a plague arrived, Nergal had come with it, that he was present in the fever, present in the moment. A man woke at night, sweating and cold and certain, with a kind of certainty that skips the thinking parts of the brain entirely and goes straight to the animal core, that he was going to die. Nergal was the certainty. The rituals against him were the most elaborate in the Assyrian repertoire. Days of fasting, days of prayer, specific animals sacrificed at specific times, specific incantations performed by specific classes of priests in a specific order that admitted no variation, because variation was where the demon entered. Variation was the crack. The incantations themselves are. I keep coming back to them when I'm doing this kind of work, and I'm not entirely sure why. There's something in them I find hard to put down. They are remarkable documents, evidence of a particular kind of courage, the courage of standing in front of something enormous and terrible and speaking to it directly, looking at it, saying, I see you, I know what you are, I know what you want. Go somewhere else. Take your hunger somewhere else. Let this person live a little longer. The incantation against Nergal made no appeal to mercy. Nergal had no mercy in any form the living could access. The incantation appealed to his other appetites, to his political position in the divine hierarchy, to the specific procedural protocols of the underworld that governed when a life could legitimately be taken. It was a legal argument performed in the dead of night by a terrified priest at the bedside of a dying person, addressed to a lion-headed god of pestilence who was somewhere in the room, invisible, present, listening or not listening. And that uncertainty, that specific uncertainty about whether you were being heard, whether the words were landing anywhere, whether the ritual was working, or whether Nergal had already decided and the performance was simply something the survivors needed in order to get through the night. That uncertainty was itself a form of terror that I find genuinely hard to describe without flattening it. Let me collect the thread. There was a moment in the court of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, the one we've been circling toward, when all of these forces converged in a way that shows the thing plainly, shows what it actually looked like from the inside, to be the most powerful human being in the world, and also to be this afraid. Ashurbanipal could read. He was the only Assyrian king who claimed this, which is itself a thing worth sitting with. That literacy in the royal court was exceptional enough to be worth recording as an achievement, that the kings who had come before him had conquered the known world without being able to read the tablets their scribes produced. Ashurbanipal read. He collected. He sent scholars across the empire with instructions to find the oldest texts, bring them back to Nineveh, to the library he was building, which would eventually hold 30,000 clay tablets and become the most complete archive of ancient knowledge in the world. A library that survived the fall of the city. The Medes and Babylonians sacked Nineveh in 612 BCE and burned it so thoroughly that the city vanished from human memory for more than 2,000 years, just gone, the way almost nothing is actually gone, but gone from living memory, gone from any continuous thread of knowledge, until the European excavators of the 19th century dug it up and found the tablets still there, still speaking. Anyway, in the library, tablets about the dark gods, exorcism series, incantation manuals, diagnostic handbooks that let a priest identify which deity or demon was causing a specific illness based on the pattern of the symptoms. A proto-medicine structured entirely around divine agency, built from observations that were real and careful and recorded with genuine precision, organized around premises that we would now. I almost wrote something here and then pulled back. I'll just say, the observations were real, the precision was real, the premises were their own. Love spells, curses, counter-curses, the words to speak at a crossroads in the dark, descriptions of omens, bird behavior, oil patterns on water, stellar movements, the sounds a person makes in their sleep. All of it recorded and systematized because knowledge was the only real protection, and knowledge had to be preserved past the death of the person who held it. Ashurbanipal stood at the center of all of this. Greatest empire, greatest library, greatest army, most sophisticated court in the world, most comprehensive theological knowledge of any king before him. And he was afraid. The inscriptions make this plain if you read them against the grain of the boasting, which is how you have to read them. The boasting is the surface. The anxiety runs beneath it like groundwater, pressurized, looking for cracks. He worried about his governor's loyalty. He worried about the omens, which were never quite clear, always ambiguous, always demanding interpretation, always leaving open the darker reading. He worried that the interpretation he had chosen was wrong, and the right one was worse. He executed his brother, Shamash Shuma Ukin, made king of Babylon as a gesture of generosity, or political calculation, or both, rose against him, and there was a civil war, 4 years of it, and it ended with Babylon burning and the brother dead in the palace flames. Suicide or execution, the sources won't commit. And I think the source's refusal to commit is itself information. And after the war, after the burning, Ashurbanipal sat in Nineveh with everything he had, and the chronicles say he was haunted, couldn't sleep, added extra purification rituals, added prayers, consulted the astronomical observers more than any king before him, scanning the sky for a sign that Ashur was still with him, that the blood of his brother had not spent the divine credit he had spent his life accumulating. This is what I want to say, and I'm going to try to say it without reaching too hard for the language of it, the hollow at the center of an Assyrian victory. That is the thing the monuments suppress. The monuments show the king above the defeated enemy, foot on the enemy's neck, hand raised toward the winged disk of Ashur overhead. The whole composition designed to communicate invulnerability and divine sanction and the settled permanence of power. The monuments do not show the king at 3 a.m, listening to the sounds of his own palace, trying to determine whether what he just heard was a servant or a conspirator, or the particular preceding silence of Nergal before the fever arrived. The monuments do not show the weight of a theology that offers divine favor in exchange for perfect obedience and never, ever delivers confirmation that the obedience has been enough. Ashurbanipal had more than any human before him, all of it, the empire, the library, the army, the priests, the rituals, the tablets, the accumulated theological knowledge of 2,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. All of it organized and running at full capacity in his service. like a machine the size of the world built to keep him safe. And it sat in him like a stone in water. Like that. That's the image. A stone dropped in, sinking, and the water closing over it, and the surface going still, and the stone still falling. Lamashtu moved through the palace at night. Pazuzu hung in the air of every room. Nergal walked the city in the form of the season's new fever. Ashur watched from above and demanded more. The demand never stopped. The satisfaction never came. He won. It wasn't enough. The rituals. This is where the theology stops being abstract and becomes something you could almost hold. Wet clay pressed between your fingers, juniper smoke rising from a copper bowl, a voice moving through memorized syllables with the particular controlled precision of someone who knows that imprecision has consequences and has internalized that knowledge so deeply it lives in the body rather than the mind. The Ashipu, the exorcists, the Akkadian word, and I find I prefer the Akkadian here because the English word flattens them immediately into something smaller than what they were. The Ashipu were among the most important people in Assyrian society, specialists, practitioners of a technical discipline that combined what we have since broken into separate categories: theology and medicine and psychology, and something close to what we'd now call forensic investigation. All of it held together by the understanding that sickness and misfortune and the specific terror that arrived in the night were communications from the divine world, messages. The Ashipu's job was to read them correctly and respond in the right language. The work began with diagnosis, not physical diagnosis in the way we'd mean it, though the Assyrian diagnostic texts are, and this genuinely surprised me when I first spent time with them, surprisingly sophisticated as clinical documents, careful and observational in ways that feel almost, I'll leave that sentence. What I mean is, before anything could be treated, the practitioner had to determine which deity or demon was responsible. The same symptom, the same fever or paralysis, or the specific inward collapsing silence that manifested as inability to speak could have different divine causes depending on the timing, the context, the patient's ritual history, the omens preceding the illness, the direction from which it seemed to arrive. You had to know what you are arguing against before you could argue, because the treatment was an argument, a structured, ritually precise, carefully built argument addressed to the power responsible, making the case for why the patient should be released. This required intimate knowledge of the theology, of the specific character of the power being addressed, its preferences and aversions, its position in the divine hierarchy, its relationships with other gods, the words and gestures most likely to move it. The Ashipu was an advocate in a cosmic legal system, standing in a sick person's room in the dark, making a case to something that may or may not have been listening, that had no obligation to listen, that operated according to logics the practitioner could study and could never fully know. The central exorcism series was the Maklu. The word means something close to burning. The ritual ran across an entire night, dusk to dawn, and was designed to combat witchcraft specifically, the spiritual attack that came from another human being rather than directly from a god or demon. It involved setting up the ritual space with specific objects in specific positions, burning figurines of the witch or sorcerer whose attack was being reversed, speaking incantations, that called on Ea, Marduk, Asaluhi to intervene, to see what was happening and act on behalf of the person suffering. I need to pause here because I've been moving through the Maklu too quickly, and I don't think it deserves that. The texts of the Maklu series are, this is one of those places where I notice myself reaching for adjectives and then distrusting them. So I'll try to be plain about it. They are among the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world. The precision of the language, the controlled rhythmic intensity that builds through the night hours, accumulating pressure, moving toward the first suggestion of dawn with a quality that you can feel even in translation, even through 3,000 years of distance. You can feel the night in them. You can feel what it was like to be in that room, performing that sequence, watching the figurines burn, waiting for the words to land somewhere. And they are disturbing because of what they assume, because of what they take for granted about daily life in an Assyrian city. They assume you can be cursed by a neighbor, by a business partner, by a jealous relative who has decided, in the privacy of whatever darkness they inhabit, to hire someone to arrange the conditions of your suffering with as much intentionality as you arrange the conditions of your protection. The illness in your child may be random, or it may be the deliberate work of someone who knows your name and wants you diminished. Someone who smiled at you yesterday across the courtyard wall. Think about what that assumption does to a community over time, what it does to the texture of ordinary trust, to the daily fabric of looking at a neighbor and not knowing, genuinely not knowing, whether the smile is a smile or something placed in front of something else. The Maklu ritual bound the community through shared practice. Everyone participated in the exorcisms. Everyone understood the protective measures. Everyone had a stake in maintaining the ritual order. And at the same time, it threaded every relationship with the possibility that the person across from you was a channel for something that wished you harm. This was a rational response to a genuinely held belief. I want to be precise about that. The suspicion wasn't pathological. It was the logical extension of a cosmology that was internally coherent, that had been tested against experience for generations, that had accumulated enough observational data in the form of people who got sick and people who recovered, and the specific circumstances surrounding both, to feel confirmed. The darkness was real. The dark forces moved through the social world as freely as they moved through the night air. Given that, yes, look carefully at the smile. Anyway, Irkala, the underworld, the great land of no return, the house of dust. Everyone went, kings and slaves, warriors and the people who swept the floors behind the warriors, the faithful who had performed every ritual correctly, and the people who had forgotten the words. Irkala received them all with equal indifference. It did not grade them. It did not sort them. It kept them equally silent, equally still, equally covered in the dust that gave the place one of its names. This is the underworld section, and I'll be honest, I'm tired. And the underworld is grim, and I don't have a way to make it otherwise, so let me just go through it. The dead wore garments of bird feathers. They ate dust and clay. They sat in the dark. The specific suffering of Irkala was the suffering of removal, the removal of warmth, color, sensation, and the specific quality of being known by someone who loves you, which turns out to be the thing you miss most when the texts try to describe what is lost. Above, in the world of light, the people who had known your name were going about their days and forgetting, slowly, with the ordinary mercy of time, letting your name slip into the space between memories where things go when they are no longer needed. That was the worst of it, that specific forgetting. The queen was Ereshkigal, and here I find I want to linger, because Ereshkigal is the figure in this whole cosmology that I keep returning to, that I find I can't quite leave alone. And I'm not entirely sure I can explain why I've kept her for this late in the telling, except that she seems to demand it. She was a force, like the others, ruled her realm with the competence her realm required, the competence of endurance, of remaining present in a place that was the negation of everything life is. She was not a villain in any legible sense. She was a person, and I use that word loosely and deliberately, condemned to inhabit a place that was the opposite of where she wanted to be, presiding over an endlessness of grey, receiving the dead with a bureaucratic consistency that was itself a kind of suffering. Because she felt it, she was not numb to it. The texts are insistent on this point, in ways that feel almost, no, I won't say it. She screamed. In the stories, Ereshkigal screamed. The word used is not the word for rage. It is closer to the word for grief. The grief of something alive in a place built around the absence of life, feeling every arrival, feeling the weight accumulate, unable to leave, unable to stop receiving, condemned to a fullness that was indistinguishable from emptiness. The dead arrived. She received them. The dust settled. She stayed. The story of Ereshkigal and Nergal is the most psychologically complicated thing in the Mesopotamian tradition. I keep coming back to this. I've read a lot of ancient mythology at this point, and this one does something the others don't quite do. Sits in the mind differently, and I'm not sure I can fully account for why. So I'll just tell it and let it do what it does. Nergal, the plague god, the agent of death, the lion-headed thing that walked through cities in the form of epidemic, was sent to the underworld as punishment or as a test. The texts won't commit to one reading, and I've stopped trying to make them. When he arrived, Ereshkigal saw him, and what happened between them is described in a way that manages to be simultaneously explicit and mysterious, simultaneously a love story and something that sits alongside love stories, the way a bruise sits alongside a mark of affection, close enough to confuse. In one version, Nergal seizes her by the hair and pulls her from her throne, and she weeps and offers him anything, if he will let her live. He lets her live. She offers him the queenship of the underworld and her bed. He takes both. They rule together. In another, softer, he comes down and they fall into each other. And then he leaves, and she cannot hold the space where he was, and she sends a messenger above demanding him returned, threatening that if he is not sent back, she will release all the dead into the living world. Every dead person from every age, everyone who has eaten dust in the house of no return. The implication being that this would be the end of the current arrangement, that the line between the living and the dead was the only thing maintaining the world in its present form, and that Ereshkigal, in her grief, the specific savage grief of someone who has finally found something worth holding and had it taken, was ready to dissolve that line entirely. This is the theology of the underworld. The boundary between death and life is maintained by specific powers who have specific personal reasons to maintain it, and those reasons are passionate and could, under the right conditions, be overwhelmed. The world almost ended because a goddess was grieving. The line almost dissolved because someone who lived in the dark had found something warm. There is something true in that. I don't know what to do with how true that feels, so I'll move on. The descent of Inanna. This is the oldest story, not hyperbole. As far as we know, it is the oldest surviving narrative, the oldest story that was written down and is still recognizably a story in the sense that it has characters who want things and meet obstacles and come back changed. It predates Homer by more than 1,000 years. It predates the biblical texts. It comes from Sumer, which is before Assyria, but the Assyrian tradition carried it, and the scholars of Ashurbanipal collected it for the library at Nineveh because they understood it to be essential, to be the kind of knowledge you preserve past the death of the person who holds it. Inanna was the goddess of love and war, both simultaneously. The Mesopotamian theological understanding held that love and war were the same appetite expressed in different directions, the same force of desire moving toward contact and conquest, the same hunger, same intensity, different arenas. Inanna was fierce, terrifying in the way that beauty is sometimes terrifying when it moves with total confidence toward what it wants. She was desire with intent, desire that did not soften itself for easier handling. She decided to go to the underworld. The texts give no single clear reason, and I think the ambiguity is deliberate, because I think the Sumerians understood that the impulse to descend, to go down into the deep thing, to find what is at the bottom of everything and look at it directly, that impulse doesn't always have a clean explanation. Sometimes you just go down. She told her servant Ninshaba, "Wait 3 days. If I haven't come back, go to the gods and ask for help." Then she descended. At each of the 7 gates, the gatekeeper demanded payment. 1 piece of clothing, 1 piece of jewelry, 1 element of her royal regalia, her crown, her measuring rod, her lapis lazuli necklace, her breastplate, her gold ring, her pectoral, her royal robe, stripped away 1 gate at a time. Each removal a kind of dying before the final dying. Each gate an instruction about what the underworld required of you, which was everything, which was the complete surrender of every external marker of who you were, until she arrived in Ereshkigal's throne room, holding nothing, wearing nothing, carrying only her own existence. Ereshkigal looked at her and killed her, fixed her on a meat hook on the wall, left her. I need to pause here, 'cause I've been moving through this sequence, and the momentum of it carries you forward, and I don't want to just carry you forward past the meat hook, because the meat hook is, I find this image genuinely difficult, and I've been sitting with this material long enough that I don't usually find things genuinely difficult, but Inanna on the meat hook is a thing I cannot make comfortable, and I think the discomfort is the point. And I think the people who first told this story knew that. And I think that is part of what makes it the oldest story worth keeping. 3 days, the upper world noticed. Animals stopped mating. Plants stopped growing. The fertility of the entire world drained away, slowly, quietly, because the goddess of fertility was dead on a hook in the underworld. Creation began winding down with the particular quietness of something approaching its end. Not catastrophically, just going still. Ninchuba went to the gods. The gods sent help in the form of small beings, creatures without sex, without appetite, without the qualities that made things subject to Ereshkigal's authority over the cycles of life and death. And so, these creatures could pass through the gates without being stripped, and they found Inanna, and they fed her the food of life and the water of life, and she came back. Anyway, the rule. There is always a rule. The underworld's rule was absolute. Nothing returns from the land of no return without sending something else down in exchange, a substitute. The demons of the underworld, the Gala, Ereshkigal's agents, ascended with Inanna to ensure she kept the bargain, moving through the upper world beside her like a dead walking. And everywhere people had mourned her absence, the Gala passed them by. Inanna had no authority to send a grieving person down, but when she arrived home and found her husband Dumuzi sitting on her throne in his finest clothes, apparently unmoved by her 3-day death, apparently having experienced nothing, or having experienced something and decided the throne was the appropriate response to it. She looked at him. She pointed. He went down. The story at this point does something I find, I want to say, beautiful. But that's not quite it. It's more that it does something unexpectedly. It turns, because Dumuzi's sister, Geshtinanna, when she learned what had happened, offered to share his time. 6 months in the underworld, 6 months above, trading the darkness back and forth between them, because she loved him enough to take half his death into herself, to make his sentence livable by dividing it, to offer her own body as a vessel for half of what he owed. 6 months dark, 6 months light, the seasons, the entire seasonal rhythm of the world organized around a deal struck in the underworld between the queen of death and the sister of a shepherd who loved him more than she feared the dust, who made an arrangement that the world has been running on ever since. The seasons are the shadow of a family's grief. I don't know what else to say about that. I've said it. It sits there. It doesn't need anything added. Here is what the dark gods were actually for. Honesty, a specific, brutal, clear-eyed honesty about what the universe is actually like. The kind of honesty that we have spent the subsequent 3,000 years gradually softening, padding, covering with more comfortable theology, and then more comfortable philosophy, and then more comfortable science, layering and layering until most people alive today move through their days in the working assumption that they are fundamentally safe, that the darkness is a problem to be solved, that the things coming in the night are technical failures rather than forces with intentions and appetites and no particular interest in human preference. The Assyrians lived on a floodplain in one of the most geologically, climatically, and politically unstable regions of the ancient world. Their rivers could destroy them, and did. Their climate could destroy them, and did. The armies of their neighbors, the plagues from the south and west, the power struggles within their own royal families, all of it could destroy them. All of it had destroyed them, repeatedly, within living memory, within the memory of the city walls that had been rebuilt on the rubble of the previous walls. Death was not an abstraction. Death was a neighbor. Death was something they had watched, move through their families and their cities with a regularity that made pretense impossible. And so they named it the lion face of Nergal, the bird feet of Lamashtu, the twisted features of Pazuzu. They gave the darkness faces and developed a relationship with it, a relationship of acknowledgement, of watchful attention, of refusing to turn away. I see you. I know you are there. I know you will come for me as you have come for everyone before me. And I am here. I am watchful. I am building the library that describes you precisely, because the only real thing I have, the only thing that actually works, even imperfectly, even most of the time, is knowledge, is naming, is a refusal to leave you nameless in the dark. That is what the dark gods were for. That is the tradition of naming the dark. The 30,000 tablets of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh were pressed into damp clay with a reed stylus and then baked. The Assyrians chose clay deliberately. They understood that baked clay was more permanent than papyrus, more permanent than wood, more durable in one specific way than stone. Stone could be carved away, papyrus could burn, but baked clay could only be broken. And even broken, it still carried the marks, still held the letter shapes, still spoke to anyone who knew how to listen. The tablets covered everything: medical texts, astronomical observations, legal codes, royal chronicles, agricultural manuals, divination handbooks for reading the future from a sacrificed sheep's liver. I'm going through this list quickly, and I know I'm going through it quickly. And I want to say plainly that each of those categories deserves more than I'm giving it here. The astronomical observations alone, the systematic, multi-generational, carefully recorded observations of celestial movement that the Assyrian scholars maintained, represent an intellectual achievement that I find hard to hold the full scale of in my head all at once. But we have somewhere to be. Among the tablets, the Enuma Elish, the creation epic, the story of how the world began, which was also, in the Assyrian telling, the story of how the darkness began. Because in this cosmology, the darkness was the raw material, the starting substance, the thing from which everything else was made. In the beginning, Apsu, the sweet water, and Tiamat, the salt water, the primordial pair, the original, undifferentiated everything. Not yet a world, not yet containing the conditions for a world, simply present, mixed, without a container to define where one ended and the other began. And from the mixing of Apsu and Tiamat, the first gods emerged. The first gods were noisy, restless. They disturbed the primordial quiet that Apsu required. Apsu decided to kill them. I need to pause here, because I want to make sure the weight of that lands before we continue. Apsu was their father. He looked at the things he had made and decided to unmake them because they were inconvenient. The texts don't present this as sophisticated malice. Apsu comes across less as a villain than as something with the self-absorbed impatience of a force that has never had to account for anything outside itself. A thing that had been quiet for so long, it had confused its own preference for quiet with a natural law. He wanted peace. He was willing to kill his children to get it. He had not yet been required to understand the difference between those two facts. Ea, the god of wisdom, found out and killed Apsu first. Preemptive murder, son killing father before the father kills him. And then Ea built his house over the corpse in the depths of the water. His son was born there, Marduk. 4 eyes, 4 ears, a presence so total that the texts strain to describe it and settle for the number 4, as if completeness of perception could be captured arithmetically. Tiamat had opposed Apsu's plan to kill the younger gods. She had, in that version, been on the right side of things. But the killing of her consort, her partner, the other half of the original everything, enraged her past any previous alignment. She assembled an army, monsters, dragons, serpents, demon things, the creatures of the primordial dark given form and direction by what I can only call grief made martial, rage organized into strategy. She named a champion, a deity called Kingu, and she placed on him the tablets of destiny, the documents that determined the fate of everything in the universe, the ultimate source of authority in the cosmos. The ultimate weapon was paperwork. I find this both absurd and completely consistent with how power actually works, and I'm moving on. Anyway, the gods were afraid. They had never faced Tiamat in rage, Tiamat the primordial salt water, Tiamat who had existed before the universe and was in some sense larger than it, not contained by it, the universe having been made inside her rather than her being made inside the universe. One by one, the gods refused to face her. Marduk went. But first, he named his price, sovereignty. If he defeated Tiamat, he would be king of all the gods. The terms were accepted. What follows is one of the most remarkable passages in ancient literature, and I want to try to do it justice, which means I need to resist the urge to perform it and just tell it. Marduk drove his winds into Tiamat's open mouth, her roaring maw, the texts say, and that phrase has been in my head for weeks since I went back through the tablets. The roaring maw of the primordial salt water drove his winds in until she could not close her mouth, until she was inflated, distended, helpless with his wind filling her, and then he drove his spear through her and cut her in two. From one half of her body, the sky. From the other, the earth. From her eyes, the Tigris and the Euphrates. From her spittle, the clouds. From her tail, the Milky Way. The world is a monster's body, reorganized, repurposed, held in shape by the continuous effort of the gods who made it from her. The sky above your head is Tiamat's flesh. The rivers that watered the Assyrian fields were Tiamat's eyes. Every cloud that crossed the sun above the city of Ashur was the spittle of the oldest, largest, most terrifying thing that had ever existed. This is where I find myself having to stop and just sit with the implication. Because the implication is, it's the thing that makes the whole Assyrian cosmology cohere, that pulls all the dark gods into a single explanatory frame. And I've been circling it all night, and here it is. The darkness was inside the world. The darkness was the world. Tiamat's body was the raw material of existence, and Tiamat was chaos, and Tiamat was primordial, and Tiamat was, in whatever sense these words mean anything, the source. The monster was everywhere. The monster was everything, transformed, cut apart, organized into sky and earth and river, held in its current shape by effort, by the continuous exertion of divine will, and only held there as long as that effort continued. The darkness was not a threat to creation. It was creation, wearing a different face. The Assyrians knew this. They knew it in the way you know a thing you have built your entire civilization on top of, a thing you have pressed into 30,000 clay tablets and baked hard so it survives past your own death. They knew it in the bones, and they hung Pazuzu above the cradle anyway. They performed the ritual anyway. They trained the priests and built the library and negotiated with the dark gods, because what else do you do? What else do you do when the thing you are afraid of is the ground beneath your feet? You name it. You speak to it precisely. You get up the next morning. This is why the rituals mattered, why the priests couldn't sleep, and the exorcists couldn't rest, and the kings performed their purification rites with that specific, desperate precision that you can still feel in the inscriptions, the pressure behind the language, the controlled terror, because the darkness had not been defeated. It was being held, continuously, daily. Every ritual and every sacrifice and every incantation spoken in the middle of the night beside a dying person was part of the holding, and the moment any piece of the holding lapsed, even briefly, even in one small corner of the ritual order, the darkness began to push back through, because the darkness was the ground state. Order was the achievement. Order was the ongoing, exhausting, collectively maintained achievement of a civilization that had looked into the primordial abyss and decided, against any reasonable expectation, to try to build something inside it. 612 BCE. The Medes came from the north, the Babylonians from the south. Between them, they found a city that had been, for a century, the largest and most magnificent city in the world. Nineveh, the city of the library, the city of the great palace walls carved with lion hunt reliefs in such precise and terrible detail that when you stand in front of them now, in whatever museum holds them, you can see the specific moment a lion's legs give out. You can see the arrow's entrance point. You can see the animal's face at the moment. It understood what was happening. 800,000 people inside those walls, a number that seems almost fictional, even with the archaeology confirming it. The city fell in a season. The walls came down. The palaces burned. The library burned or was consumed by the fire, except that the clay tablets, baked already hard, were baked harder by the flames meant to destroy them, and they survived, preserved by the catastrophe, permanent because of the fire rather than despite it. The gods stayed. Nergal stayed in the plague. Lamashtu stayed in the night, beside every cradle. Pazuzu stayed in the hot, dry wind from the southwest. Ereshkigal stayed in the underworld, receiving the dead with her unceasing competence. Ashur stayed in the winged disk, watching from above the ruins of his city. The city was gone. The empire was gone. In 2 generations, the civilization that had conquered Egypt and burned Babylon and assembled 30,000 tablets of knowledge in the greatest library in the world, gone so completely that when the Greek historian Xenophon marched his army past the ruins of Nineveh in the 5th century BCE, less than 200 years after the fall. He did not know what he was looking at. He described mounds beside the Tigris, old ruins, abandoned. Some people once had been here. He did not know their name. He walked past the library in the ground and kept moving. I need to pause here, because I find the Xenophon detail, and I've kept it in every version of this I've told. I don't know why exactly. It's not the most dramatic detail. It's not even the most historically significant. I find it the most quietly devastating thing in this entire account. 200 years. That's not a long time in the scale of what we've been talking about. 200 years, and the man walks past the ruins of the most powerful civilization in the world and writes the word mounds. He has no other word for it. Mounds. The tablets were in the ground, baked into the clay beneath the mounds beside the Tigris, holding in their compressed cuneiform everything that Assyria had ever known about the dark, and they held it for 2,500 years, which is a span of time my brain processes as a number rather than a duration, because the actual duration is, I can write 2,500 years. I cannot feel 2,500 years, and I've decided that's acceptable. Anyway, 1849, a young British diplomat named Austen Henry Layard was excavating the mounds beside the Tigris and found a room full of clay tablets, thousands of them, tens of thousands, covering the floor in a layer that, when the lamplight moved across it, he wrote, the floor seemed to breathe. He didn't immediately understand what he had found. He sent the tablets to the British Museum in London, where they sat in labelled boxes for years, catalogued and numbered and unread, because nobody in the 19th century could read cuneiform. The tablets waited. They'd been waiting since before the word waiting had the meaning it has now, so a few more years in boxes in London was nothing. George Smith read them. Self-taught Assyriologist, started his career as an engraver, ended it as one of the most important scholars of the ancient Near East. And I'm giving him 2 sentences here, when he deserves an entire evening of his own. But I don't have the time, and the tablets are what matter. Smith sat with the collection in the British Museum and worked out what they said. He read the creation epic. He read the medical texts and the astronomical records and the divination manuals. He read the royal inscriptions. He read the incantation series. And then in November of 1872, in front of an audience that included the Prime Minister of Britain, he translated a fragment of a tablet that described a great flood, gods deciding to destroy humanity, a single survivor, a boat, animals, the waters receding, a dove sent out, returning with a leaf. The room went quiet, because the audience understood what they were hearing. They knew this story. They had been told this story was theirs, specifically theirs, of divine origin, given to one people and one tradition and no other. And here was a clay tablet from a library buried under a mound beside the Tigris for 2,500 years, and the story was already there, already written, already baked hard into the ground, and it had been there first. I find this. I've tried to describe what I find in this moment, and I keep arriving at the wrong word, something that means simultaneously confirmed and unsettled and enlarged, and I don't think English has that word, so I'll leave it at, the room went quiet, and I understand why the room went quiet. the dark library of a dark civilization, speaking from the ashes of the fire that is supposed to destroy it. We were here first. We knew this. We wrote it down. We baked it into clay because we understood that clay survives. The dark gods of Assyria were buried. Burial is not death. There is a question I want to leave with, a question that can't be answered cleanly, and I'm not going to pretend it can, because the clean answer would be wrong. What do we lose when we stop naming the darkness? The Assyrians named it with precision. They gave it faces and attributes and rituals and texts. They built an entire architecture of naming around the things that terrified them, and the architecture served a function even where it failed at the literal task, even where the ritual didn't hold Nergal back, even where the figurine didn't fool Lamashtu into the clay. The architecture gave people something to do in the face of what couldn't be controlled. Agency, the agency of response, the voice that speaks into the dark, even without certainty that it will be heard. The act of naming as a form of standing your ground. We have dismantled the architecture. We have replaced parts of it with better things, medicines that work against the diseases Nergal walked through, as well as any lion-headed deity ever did or better. Public health systems that have genuinely reduced the infant mortality that gave Lamashtu her domain. Psychiatric frameworks that can identify and sometimes treat things the Assyrians understood as demonic possession. These are real replacements, real improvements. I'm not going to romanticize the Assyrian approach to childhood illness. I'm not romanticizing it. But the architecture did something else too, something the replacements don't fully cover, and I find myself uncertain how to name it, which is ironic given what we've been talking about. The architecture said, the darkness is real. Here is its face. Here is what it wants. Here is the ritual. It may fail. Perform it anyway. The architecture was honest about failure in a way that our current frameworks sometimes aren't. Honest that the ritual might not work, that the prayer might not be heard, that Nergal was coming through the city regardless of what the priest said in the dead of night, that Ereshkigal was down there receiving everyone without distinction, that the ground beneath your feet was a monster's body held together by effort, and the effort could tire, and sometimes it did tire, and on those nights the darkness came back through the floor. This is the thing I keep returning to late in this, later than I should be working on it. The Assyrians looked into the same dark we look into. They saw something like what we see when we let ourselves actually look, which most of us most of the time. And here something almost surfaces, some more contemporary frame for this. And I pull back from it because it isn't the right register, and because the Assyrian version says it better anyway. They named the dark. They performed the ritual. They got up the next morning. The tablets are in the British Museum now. Some of them. Some are in Baghdad. Some are in Berlin. Some are still in the ground beside the Tigris, still waiting, still holding in their compressed and patient cuneiform, whatever they were pressed with 3,000 years ago. The darkness they named is still there. It kept their name, but not entirely. The darkness is still here. The dark that lives at 3 in the morning. The dark that arrives when the person you love most is sick and nobody knows why yet. when the tests are still pending, when the doctor's face did something in the hallway that you caught and are now carrying alone. The dark is still here. The dark that comes when you wake with that specific certainty. The certainty that moves faster than reasoning, that reaches the animal core of you before your mind has caught up, that something is wrong, and you cannot name what it is. That dark has always been here. It was here when the Assyrian priest walked the ziggurat corridors in the black hour before dawn, with his lips already moving through the first syllables of the day's first negotiation. We don't have a ritual for it. We have things that resemble rituals: the midnight scroll, the repeated checking of a phone, the making of tea that you will not drink, the lying very still and trying to breathe carefully as though breathing carefully will help. We have these, but we don't have the trained voice that knows how to speak into the specific quality of 3 a.m. darkness and say, with the weight of 10 generations of practice behind it, I see you, I know what you are, and I am here, and I am speaking your name, and you will not have what you came for tonight. Maybe this is what we reach for when we listen to stories in the dark. Maybe. And I'm aware this is the part where I'm supposed to tie it together cleanly, and I find I can't, not without lying about it slightly. Maybe what we want is the thing the Assyrian priests had, which was the specific courage of naming, the specific, ancient, deeply human act of lying in the dark and saying out loud, in words with weight and shape, I know you are there. I know you are there. It isn't reassurance. I want to be precise about this because I spent this whole account trying not to soften things, and I don't want to soften this either. The Assyrian ritual was not reassurance. The priest speaking the incantation at midnight did not believe with certainty that it would work. The tablets say this plainly in the places where the tablets speak plainly. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes Nergal takes what he came for. Sometimes Lamashtu is not fooled by the clay. The ritual was performed anyway, with precision, with the best language available, with full knowledge that the darkness might take what it wanted regardless. The ritual was the thing you did in the face of that knowledge, the voice you used despite that knowledge. Let me collect the thread one last time. Let the weight of Nineveh settle. Let the tablets rest in their clay, in the ground beneath the mounds beside the Tigris, still speaking to no one and to everyone in a compressed and patient cuneiform of people who baked their knowledge hard because they understood impermanence in their bones. Let Ashur hover in his winged disk above the ruins of his city, above the ruins of every city built in his name, watching with those eyes that the royal inscriptions could never quite adequately describe and eventually stop trying to describe. Let Nergal walk through the night. He walks through every night. He has always walked through every night. There is a part of me that finds a strange comfort in the consistency of that, even knowing I shouldn't. But let him walk through some other part of it. Let Lamashtu hear the sound of the old words and feel for a moment whatever the ancient word was for hesitation. Anyway, let Pazuzu hang above the door, dog head, scorpion tail, wings spread, that face caught between agony and ecstasy, that is probably just the face of a force that has never had to choose between them. Let him keep at bay the things that would move through the window if something were not there to meet them. He is not gentle. He has never been gentle. He doesn't protect you because he loves you. He protects you because of the geometry of what he hates, and you are inside that geometry tonight, and that will have to be enough. And for the Assyrians, it was enough. It was what was available, and they took it. Name the darkness. Name it with whatever you have, with the words available to you at this hour in this room. However far they fall from the elaborate, multilingual precision of the Ashipu, with his years of training and his library of 30,000 tablets. Name it imprecisely if that is all you have. Name it with the wrong word if the right word isn't coming. The Assyrians knew their naming wasn't sufficient. They knew that naming Nergal didn't stop Nergal, that building the best ritual system their civilization could produce didn't guarantee anything except that you had tried, that you had refused the alternative, that you had looked at the dark and opened your mouth and made sound rather than silence. They did it because the doing of it was itself the thing, the oldest thing, the act that separates. I started to go somewhere with that sentence, and I'll leave it unfinished, because you already know where it goes. If tonight carried you somewhere, down into the ziggurat corridors, into the smoke of the exorcism fire, into the library baked hard by the fire meant to erase it, into the room where George Smith translated a flood story and a room full of people went very quiet, then something waits for you in the next one. Another door, another darkness, another civilization that built something extraordinary in the space between what it feared and what it could not stop fearing. All you have to do is come back. Take the fire with you. Leave the rest. The great land of no return stays where it belongs. Good night.